Hello and welcome to another remote STEM lesson. Today we're actually going to learn about one of my favorite topics, simple machines. Machines that help us do everyday things and make our job a lot easier. Let's get into it and let's see what we can learn. Simple machines come in 6 forms. We have pulleys, levers, wheels and axles, wedges and inclined planes, and screws. Pulleys are a wheel with a groove through which a cord is passed. They're able to be used so that we can change the direction of a force. So rather than pulling an object up, we can now pull down, making it a lot easier for us. Levers are our next simple machine, and they can be found in so many different objects around the home. A lever has 2 main components, a fulcrum and a lever. It's in the name, but you'll see what I mean. Using levers, we're able to use mechanical advantage by moving the fulcrum. In this case, we can use 1 kilo to raise a 3 kilo weight. Levers allow us to make this trade-off where we use less force over a longer distance to have the same result. Inclined planes allow us to gradually fight the force of gravity. When we ascend, go up, it's much easier to roll up a hill, say a meter, than it is to actually lift up the bike. Wedges can be found in anything that helps us separate an object by forcing it into 2 different opposite directions. Knives are a great example. Scissors are also an example of a wedge, but there's also a lever in a pair of scissors. Now screws, if you think about screws, they're actually rotated inclined planes. If you ever look at the thread of a screw, it's actually on a slight angle. My favorite simple machine, the wheel and axle. The wheel is essentially a large disc. The wheel allows us to reduce the contact friction when moving objects and thus makes it much easier to move heavy objects. So here's our first simple machine, known as a pulley. What a pulley allows us to do is change the direction of a force. So imagine we have a 10 kilogram weight that obviously wants to get drawn down towards the earth because of gravity. It's actually quite hard to lift up. So what a pulley allows us to do is actually pull on it upwards while pulling on a rope downwards. Now if you imagine pulling a rope down, it's actually much easier than lifting a heavy object up. And that's what a pulley does. It allows us to change the direction of a force. So we've all seen screws around the house, but I'm going to give you a different example to actually explain how they work. Imagine you had to climb a mountain and it was really steep on the side. It's actually really difficult and you might not be able to accomplish it. But say we wanted to get to the top of the mountain and we took a zigzag path, always going up but at a shallower angle. This means we can actually achieve this goal, though much more slowly. So what a screw allows us to do is take a longer path at a shallower angle to get to the top. How it actually ends up looking is a inclined plane around the cylinder that rotates. Now let's look at inclined planes. Inclined planes allow us to go from a low point to a high point. I've got 3 different examples here, 2 of which are using inclined planes and 1 of which is not. Can you imagine you got to a building or a wall and you needed to get to the top? It's quite hard. You need a lot of force to be able to jump to the top in one go. It might actually be impossible. But what if you had a ramp? Maybe it's a steep ramp. You would be able to walk up there, and it would be quite hard because it's quite steep, but you would get there. It would take you a longer distance, as you can see with the red line, but you would get there. What if we wanted the easier option? We could have a shallower ramp. It would take much longer in terms of distance, but the force we need to climb up that hill is much less. So the trade-off, remember, for simple machines is more distance, but less force. And that's a perfect example here. Wheels and axles are one of the most important simple machines. They revolutionise transport and what allow us to actually transport very heavy objects quite easily. Can you imagine a jumbo jet without wheels rolling off the ground? We actually need those wheels to reduce the friction that occurs when the earth comes in contact with an object. So if we have a 10 kilogram object trying to be pushed along the ground, you'll see it's quite hard to do so. But if we add a set of wheels and axles at the bottom, maybe put that object on a cart or a shopping trolley, it actually becomes quite easy to push. So wheels and axles allow us to reduce the surface friction when moving an object. Our next simple machine is a lever. A lever is made up of two components, a fulcrum and a lever. Levers allow us to magnify forces in a way that we can actually lift up really heavy objects. Given this example at the top, if we have a fulcrum right in the middle, a 10 kilogram weight over here will balance a 10 kilogram weight over there. If, however, we wanted to lift up 30 kilos using the same 10 kilograms of force, we can do this using a lever. All we have to do is move the fulcrum closer to the weight. This means when we apply 10 kilos over here, it will balance the object on the other side, therefore lifting it. The reason we can do that is because this length is now much longer. So we've applied that force over a much longer length. And that allows us to essentially magnify the forces on this side to lift a much heavier object. A wedge is a simple machine that separates objects into two different parts. Think about knives, scissors, anything that cuts an object. What it does is it cuts down and separates that object into two different sides. By being curved in at the bottom and being quite sharp, it allows us to separate an object. A wedge can also be held to hold things in place. You might use a wedge to close your door and keep it open. And understanding how they work will actually help when designing and inventing. Right now, your challenge is to identify as many simple machines within your house. How many can you find? Then, when you're ready, it's time for a STEM challenge. Okay, LF, now it's your turn to put your knowledge of simple machines to the test, where you're going to use your understanding of levers to create a catapult. I've used some recycled cardboard, which I've folded up and made nice and stiff using rubber bands. What you could use is a ruler, which would be even better. Now I'm going to test this out on the floor in a second. I'm going to use my hands so I can be nice and consistent with the force, pushing down. And then I'm going to use a piece of chalk inside my release mechanism. Now see how you go. You might not use the same materials as me, but the principle's the same. Can you create a lever with a fulcrum to launch some kind of object, maybe into a basket, a container of some sort? Remember, how you position your lever on your fulcrum will change how the force projects the object. Maybe you can test out with a longer or shorter lever and see how that works for you. Love to see what you do.